More than 1/4 of the high school students in the Boston Public Schools fail to graduate in 4 years. This year, the graduation rate was down for the first time in a decade, and the gap between black and white students was even larger. One response to the problem is a new collaboration to monitor students more closely and provide more help during the high school years and after. To tell us about the effort are the executive director of the Boston Opportunity Agenda, Kristin McSwain, and the director of Youth Transitions with the Boston Private Industry Council, Kathy Hamilton. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I want to start with Kristin. I made it sound like we have this bad news story. I guess it's not unusual for urban school districts, but how bad would you say things are in Boston as far as the graduation rate?
So I think that our graduation rate, as you mentioned, has been increasing over the past decade. And this is the first time that we've seen a dip in it. One of the things to understand is the actual number of our high schoolers over time has been getting smaller because our population has been getting smaller. So I think we have room to improve, which we've always had. I think we're going to want to see what the number is next year to see if this is a downward trend or if this is sort of an anomaly for this point in time to be able to make those assessments. But in the meantime, there's some work that's happening that I think will give us a better understanding in real time about how we're doing it. And that's the work that we wanted to talk to you about today.
Yeah. Kathy, there was a study a couple of years ago about students who were off track for graduating from high school in 4 years. But one of the other things I noticed was a number that certainly grabbed me was that 1,900 students in Boston every year switch from one high school to another. I guess you're focusing on that in this program, right?
Along with chronic absence, yes. The big focus is chronic absence because that's 6,000 high school students, and there's about 15,000 total high school students to give a sense of proportion. So we'll be doing some work to better track data and interventions for that population. And then for the 1,900 who transfer, we want to better track where they go and have their records follow them, have the schools that receive them aware when they're coming and welcome them so that they can have a smoother transition.
Kristin, what exactly do you think needs to be tracked, and starting when with these students?
So I think for the transfer students in particular,
whether it's about transferring students or signs of academic trouble, maybe.
So I think those are probably two slightly different questions, and part of the tracking depends on the moment in time. So when we talk about the transfer students, sometimes the amount of time between the student arriving at the door and their records coming with them is sizable. And so what we want to do is, in real time, be able to have a dashboard that says, Kathy arrived today, she's over age, and we need to know, was that over age because she repeated 9th grade twice, or was that over age because she repeated 1st grade and 3rd grade but has been doing well? So those are the things sometimes you don't know about a student when they walk in addition to where they are actually academically, that would be helpful to know. So those are the kinds of dashboards we're going to put in place so that a principal or administrator, headmaster would be able to say, this is what I know about Kathy, how she's doing, and what we need to be picking up on as we move forward, instead of a longer period of discovery where gaps might happen for that student in transition. Other things that we're tracking with this grant are chronic absenteeism. Is the student present on a daily basis so that they can be learning in addition to sort of the academic pieces of their progress and performance?
Kathy, in the Private Industry Council, over the years, you've done a lot of outreach to re-engage students. What do you think is going on when they're chronically absent?
Well, a number of things, and it's interesting because there's currently a campaign. There's a cross-sector group headed up by the Boston Public Schools Opportunity Youth Department, where we're focusing on a campaign to bring in more, to keep students attending more than 90% chronic absences, being absent 10% or more. And what we're hearing from both those that drop out and students who are absent a lot are a number of things. Sometimes the climate, they fear discipline. Sometimes they feel that there aren't enough activities that they're interested in, whether that's sports, clubs, or a lot of interest in careers. Sometimes they don't feel like anybody would notice if they're not there. They don't feel connected to adults and students in the building, and that's a big piece of the work that the attendance committee is doing with individual schools. Not only will the schools get dashboards that allow them to not just track attendance, but track those who are chronically absent and how they're doing. and also to try to intervene with them and track the success of those interventions. Like there's this idea, Todd Rogers of Harvard has a research-based approach where you send a letter home to a student who's chronically absent to their parent, and you compare their attendance to the average, kind of like the electric bills do, and they find that just doing that alone, you get a 10 to 15% improvement in chronic absence. So the rate of chronic absence would go down by 10 to 15%. So they're going to try a few approaches like that and teach schools to track how effective those approaches are at the individual level. And of course, we'll also be tracking that at the district level.
Kristin, a lot of this program is based on a grant for data collection and structuring. I mean, it sounds like this is common data that people hadn't structured very well before now, maybe.
Well, I think there's a difference between what happens in an individual school building and what the principal and the headmaster and the teachers might know in the building and what you see at the school system level. So that's one reason you want to be able to have the data dashboards, is to be able to roll it all up. That there's not always necessary capacity for. But the other thing is really what Kathy said around tracking the particular interventions, because we want to know for this population of students what's working the best. Or are there particular sets of students for whom some things work and other things don't? And we need to tailor how we're working with them, but we want to do it in a way that helps us see both individual students but also cohorts of students and where we're being successful.
Kathy, I know there are students at this age who might be experiencing some really extreme disruption or trauma, violence, extreme poverty. But I remember reading the Globe series about some high school students. It seems that part of the problem here are you've got some good, promising students who sort of lose focus when they're in their junior year, maybe. Can you help students like that with a program like this?
Yes, well, actually, in the education world, they have what they call the tiered intervention system, which this project will use as well. That's you implement. Tier 1 is things that will affect all students. So, like the letter I just mentioned. Tier 2, that usually gets to 85% of the students, and then another 10% require more targeted interventions. So your students that have more trauma, they might require like a coach. For example, City Year is in a lot of schools, and they pair students with indicators like chronic absence or poor grades with coaches that kind of help them make their way through their day and help them learn different ways to adapt. So building the relationship that a lot of them need and teaching them ways to cope with teachers, authority, academics, tutoring. And then the third level is intensive intervention, and that might be something like counseling or behavioral health. It might involve engaging the family at that point. So they try to really look at all three tiers, and they're doing that with this approach.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Kathy Hamilton from the Boston Private Industry Council and Kristin McSwain from the Boston Opportunity Agenda. Kristin, another important part of this program involves Bunker Hill Community College. I think they've had so far a pretty strong focus on the transition from high school, but how does this program make that work even better?
So one of the things that Bunker Hill is really looking at is how all of the ways that their students interact with them, particularly students of color and male students of color. They've been working with cohorts to identify the barriers that are systemic for being successful for those groups of young people at Bunker Hill. And so they've been having some work done around focus groups, around mentors, around culturally sensitive teaching practices and culturally sensitive admin practices. And what they want to do is use the data to figure out which of those things are working and improving the persistence of their young men of color, particularly, and then where should they invest further resources in either scaling those practices across the entire university or in finding new practices where they continue to have gaps.
Okay, what about the obstacles for students once they've finished high school and they go to a community college? Is it mainly about finances? Is it other things?
It's a number of things. Many of them test into what we call developmental education. That's high school level courses that they need to complete to prepare them for college level. And that can get discouraging for them. So another intervention that Bunker Hill has is they're streamlining the developmental courses. For example, they're combining 2 in 1 semester so you can go through twice as fast. They're allowing students to substitute their GPA for taking the test because some people are just bad test takers. I think finance is another one as well. And it's not just the money, it's navigating the financial aid process, like remembering every year that you have to reapply. The standard to which you have to get your tax documents in order is pretty high. They have to be exactly in order, and it has to be done in a certain way by a certain time. So they have to engage their parents in that process. So not only is it they need money, but you have to go through a lot of steps to get financial aid that you're eligible for.
Thank you both very much, Kathy Hamilton and Kristin McSwain. In a moment, we'll tell you about a summer learning opportunity for local students at MIT.